All right, good evening again, everyone. Thank you for coming and braving the graveyard shift of today's conference day. But don't worry, it will be super exciting, so you will forget that it is close to dinner already very soon. So as you can see, we have three fantastic speakers here. We hope to engage you very actively in this very challenging topic that we're going to be discussing today. The name is intriguing, as is the topic, and I think it's fair to say that it is not a very well developed field in terms of corruption studies. It's an emerging space, lots of discussions about it, lots of myths, lots of uncertainties, lots of promise, but also probably lots of risks that come along with it. So we hope to unveil the myth a little bit today, together with you as the audience. Obviously, for those of you who've walked in randomly and haven't Googled carbon markets, let me just say a few words about them, but my fellow panelists, or my panelists, have much more knowledge, so I'll go over to them very quickly. So first of all, of course, the idea of carbon markets is that they are supposed to be a market-oriented solution to mitigate climate change. They're a trading system. Carbon markets are a trading system in which credits can be sold and bought. They're voluntary and non-voluntary ones. And one tradable carbon credit equals 1 ton of carbon dioxide reduced, sequestered, or avoided. Now, I imagine we'll primarily be talking about voluntary carbon markets. Those are the freely tradable ones today. And the key question in these markets, like any market, when we're dealing with financial products, is the trust in these products, that they represent what they are supposed to represent. This is not just a challenge that's unique to carbon markets, certainly, and many discussions have been had in other sectors as well. But because this sector is so new, there are many questions to it, how to ensure that what we are buying and selling are in fact what we are buying and selling. And so while we are focusing today on the question of corruption risks or integrity risks in this space, there are many other questions to this emerging market, of course. And so questions about assurance, certification, verification become quite central. Of course, like any new market, the government plays a big role as it establishes its regulatory issues, as it establishes its systems, its guardrails, and so all of these spaces are, as we all know, because we're at the International Anti-Corruption Conference, fraught with corruption risks. Just as a small anecdote to get us started, I was, before coming here today, I was reading a report about one of our state-owned enterprise partners in a country that shall remain nameless, and that state-owned enterprise is engaged in the forestry sector. And has been tasked by the government to start issuing carbon credits. We have been working with the state-owned enterprise for a long time, so we know about the challenge, the integrity challenges, the corruption challenges that they experience, and their challenges with mitigating these. And now they are thrown in this completely new space, much like us today in this conversation, not knowing exactly what to do, but having a mandate to address climate change and to do their share in the process. And so, as we are looking at the partnership with this agency, with the state-owned enterprise, we're finding that every stage of this process contains certain corruption risks. The preparation stage, the permitting and licensing risks, which many of us are familiar with from other spaces, certification, verification, and checks at the end, especially when they involve government inspectors. And of course, when we're talking about private actors in many jurisdictions, when we're talking about purely the engagement of private actors, sometimes that's not even considered corruption in national legislations. So I think it's, in a way, a perfect storm to come up with another metaphor that sort of fits the theme of an emerging market that is subject to many regulations as it emerges, that is subject to many myths and misunderstandings, and that require many new ways for us to think about how to address these corruption risks. However, like many spaces that we all work in, that we're starting to understand from an anti-corruption perspective, once you start taking it apart, you see certain elements that seem vaguely familiar. And so I hope in the conversation today, we will start identifying certain elements and certain risks that you are familiar with, and that will allow you to, whatever work you do in fighting corruption, contribute to reducing corruption risks in this space. Because as we know, it's a collective effort, and it's something that certainly no one entity can tackle alone. So I've spoken a lot longer than I had anticipated speaking, so I will quickly move over to our panelists. And we have three fantastic panelists. I will introduce them as they go about their presentations. We have 2 rounds of panelists, comments, and then we'll go to the audience for questions and answers. So please scribble down your questions, thoughts, and comments, and we'll get to you very quickly, hopefully. So our first panelist is Brice Burma. He is a long-time collaborator of ours. He leads the climate and environment team that is increasing in size all the time at Transparency International. He's been probably the leading figure in this specific space. So grateful to have him here today to share his experience, which is frankly a big deal. There's not a lot of experience in this space. And so, Brice, if you could, I know you have a case study to illustrate the issue and the challenges with the issue. So if you could use that perhaps to give us an overview of the key corruption risks in the space as you see them. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanny, and thanks to all of you for joining. I think it is probably the most controversial topic in the climate environmental space at the moment, but it has been so for a while. I was actually discussing with some international organizations today and telling them that we actually still have to say that there are actually corruption risks, and as you mentioned, quite a few, unfortunately, when it comes to carbon markets. And I remember it wasn't the last COP, I think it was the COP before, where there was a session on carbon markets, and I just nicely asked the question to the speakers that based on the different scandals and issues that carbon markets were facing, what were their suggestions to make sure that, you know, it gets better? And the response was from a person who was from a very famous university that they had never heard any corruption problems in carbon markets. And there has been quite a few for several years now, also in the press. So I think that shows that there is a level of denial, let's say, in that space, unfortunately, and that doesn't help, I think. But yeah, I wanted to take a bit of time because I assume that most of you don't really know. I'm more from the governance anti-corruption community, so don't necessarily know much about carbon markets. And I wanted to mention through an example of an actual project or an actual case, let's say, what happened. And I had the privilege to also go directly to the site, which is in Zimbabwe, a project called the Kariba project. And I visited this project with some of my colleagues several years ago. But yeah, I will come back to that. So basically what happened is that I think it was more than 10 years ago, Steve Wenzel, which is like a Zimbabwean tycoon, approached a company called South Pole that is kind of making the connection between potential buyers and project implementers, and wanted to develop a carbon project in Zimbabwe. So they started distributing flyers in the Kariba region with trees having some dollars coming out of the trees to basically say to communities that they will have a lot of benefits if they join that project. And he even promised that 70% of the revenues of those projects will go directly to them. Then what he did was setting up a company called Carbon Green Investments to receive the sales proceeds from South Pole and open an account in a tax haven. And then what needs to be done is to make some calculations to be able to say to verifiers that in 30 years, this is what would happen if the project is not being implemented. And the assumption was made there that if the project is not being implemented, there will be total deforestation. So there won't be almost any tree standing, to make it short. Then money started flowing. On the ground, a few things were built for the communities. But then, a few years after, it came the time where the calculations need to be compared with the reality. And the reality actually showed that the deforestation, the prediction, the explosive predictions were not correct, and that the deforestation was actually much lower than anticipated. In the months after this announcement, there was actually a good time for carbon markets, and at that point, a lot of credits were actually being sold to companies like Porsche, Nestle, the Cannes Film Festival, and others. This was at the time when those actors already knew that the calculations were wrong. And then that's the time when scrutiny started to also increase, and there were several articles, including in The Guardian and others, which kind of questions a bit some of those carbon projects. Inside the company, the South Pole company, a whistleblower filed also a complaint saying there has been some miscalculations. We cannot continue selling credits. Those credits are worthless. But the company kind of didn't act on the whistleblower complaint and continued going on until actually I think a person was actually checking the satellites images and so on and kind of putting out there that there were probably a big problem with this project, and then the buyers that I mentioned before starting calling and saying, are you sure that my credits are worth something? And according to the investigations, one of the problems was not only that those credits were worthless, but actually the original figure as well of the share of the benefits that I mentioned initially, so 70% were kind of being promised, whereas it seems that almost 60% was kept by this initial investor, and benefits to the communities were actually quite limited. So that's kind of the story. Some parts of the story might be kind of not approved by some of those actors, but what I wanted to say as well is that, as I was saying, I was in Zimbabwe, and I had conversations with my colleague there who were saying, we're trying to talk to the project implementers, to the different actors, because we see some red flags there. And I think I mentioned a few things that should have been a red flag for when we talk about corruption for quite a few actors. And I mean, Johanni, you just mentioned the governments are also playing a big role. And at that point, I also remember clearly that my colleague was trying to talk to the government and say, in Zimbabwe, there is no regulation whatsoever. This is also a red flag. This will go wrong. But you know, the Zimbabwe's context, for those who know, was quite difficult at that moment, and the government didn't have the capacity to kind of legislate or create regulations around that. And it's actually, as we speak, kind of creating those regulations, but you know, kind of 20 years after almost. So coming back to the kind of the integrity risks or the corruption issues, I think one of the major problems is that surrounding those carbon offsets is that there is an inherent tension because there is a dual goal of kind of protecting the planet, limiting emissions, and making money. And I think this tension is kind of creating a lot of those integrity problems. I mentioned that there were some studies. Some of you might have seen that, for example, The Guardian made some investigations and say that 80% almost of the top 50 biggest offset projects were basically junk or worthless. So, and there has been, unfortunately, quite a few other studies coming to the same conclusion. And as you were briefly mentioning, there are basically two types of markets. One is a compliance market or cap on trade. There is the EU ETS, for example, the EU emission trading system, where there is a number of allowances being given to companies. And then there is the voluntary market, where anyone and many companies are kind of investing in. So I think, yeah, we will probably talk a bit more about the voluntary carbon market, but in the compliance market, some of those issues or challenges are also existing. So bear with me, I just wanted to mention 5 kind of key corruption risks that I think we can see. The first one is related to design flaws. So there is a number of challenges linked to the fact that this market, unlike the usual conventional commodity market, the buyer and the seller don't really have an interest in the quality of what is a virtual, artificial good being created. And it makes it also very difficult to verify. So this makes that, yeah, the incentives for both sides are quite limited to make sure there is the high quality. And there was in 2013, so also more than 10 years ago, Interpol already noted that there are many ways to manipulate the carbon measurements that are very complex. And I'm sure that's one of the challenges that you're also facing, Mary. So there are issues of capture, of bribery, of double counting. This is like already quite a lot of difficult challenges. The second challenge or corruption risk is linked to the intermediaries. The intermediaries are, in these markets, quite opaque. The prices are often secret, and there is a study showing that 90% of intermediaries are not declaring their fees. So we all know that the more opaque the situation is, the more risk of corruption there are, and the more difficult, if we don't have transparency, the accountability is. The third one is around project implementation. And there I would say that it's similar to most of the climate projects, which means that often carbon projects are in remote location. That makes consultation with communities, participation of communities, verification, monitoring, all of that very difficult. So this is not, I would say, specific to carbon market projects, but to most of climate projects. And I think in the project that I was mentioning, Kariba, this is also the type of things, the type of pattern we see where there is very little information that is passed to communities and very little understanding. Sometimes contracts are being negotiated, in English, whereas the levels the level of English would be very limited in a community context. So it's very easy to get also problems there. The fourth challenge would be, I already mentioned it, around the verification. I mean, there is quite a conflict of interest there because certifiers are paid by the project implementers, which create clearly conflict of interest. This is not something that is only being seen in the carbon market, but I think in other areas like traditional financial sectors, those conflicts of interest are usually better managed, let's say. So I think that's something that we've seen as well, and that's something that even in official compliance markets like the CDM, there has been also a lot of allegation of corruption and conflict of interest of who is approving the projects and how, basically. And we can come back to that. And the fifth and last point, I promise, is around the market themselves and the finance-related risks. And there, again, that's not specific to carbon markets, but we've seen a lot of cases of fraud in carbon markets, money laundering, tax evasion, even in Europe with VAT carousel cases that you might have seen that, for example, costed France 385 million euros. And I'll stop here for now.
Thank you. For now, we'll come back to risk 6 through 500 later. Thank you, Brice, for the fantastic overview, both of the markets themselves, as well as the key risks as you see them. So I'll turn to our second panelist today. Mary Gilmore Maurer is the Senior Legal Counsel and Interim Director at Verra. Verra is a nonprofit organization that develops and manages standards for sustainable development, climate action, and responsible business practices. We've talked a lot about standards, so you're in a somewhat unenviable position today. But we are here among friends, so I'm sure everybody is very keen to hear about your experience developing and managing these standards in light of all the red flags as we see them in the anti-corruption community. So over to you, and thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, it's really a pleasure to be here. Also having benefited from some of the previous sessions looking at environmental crime, and there are these really important and critical links. And a lot of the challenges that you mentioned, we recognize those. And we see those as well. I think when in your initial comments you mentioned that in some ways corruption is not new in this field, but our understanding of how people implement corruption, what activities lead to corruption. I think all the actors in this space are really trying to understand this better and to get a grip of that, and that includes all of us. And this is an important task that faces all of us, and we as Verra, as a standard setter, take that very seriously. I'm not sure how many in the audience are familiar with carbon markets. We've already had a really great overview. I thought it might be just helpful to go over again, what are verified carbon credits as in the voluntary carbon markets. And it's important that we mention here that Verra operates in the voluntary carbon markets, not in the compliance markets. So verified carbon credit, or VCC, is produced when a project or activity removes or reduces greenhouse gas emissions as compared to a baseline counterfactual scenario. And this is where we already run into our first kind of difficulty and challenge. There are a lot of people with a lot of experience who are working on the scientific basis for these scenarios, but they can also change over time. Science changes, the way in which we measure things changes. But that is the kind of the basic method there, that it's based on this kind of counterfactual, and that we have to almost imagine what would happen had this project not happened. And that goes to this idea and this concept of additionality. The project cannot have happened unless there is this, they register as this type of carbon offsetting project. And well, how is a project verified? So a project does, with Verra, have to follow strict methodologies and standards that we have. And when these are met, and I think, and this is an important point of clarification, and I think is not always maybe recognized in the kind of the chain of events when a project comes to us for registration in our registry. There is an independent validation verification body that actually validates and verifies a project. We as Verra don't do that. Those VVBs, as we call them, validation verification bodies, they are independently accredited with separate bodies as well in each country that are set up to an ISO standard. And they have a key criteria of impartiality. And so that process of validation of a project initially and then subsequent verification when credits are issued happens separately. And then it comes back to us once we get that validation verification report, and we proceed with the process of a pipeline listing and then potentially a registration once a project has met not only our standard, complied with our standard, but also that scenario is basically verified by the VVB. So and as part of that, projects have to demonstrate additionality, that they will remove or reduce those emissions, and that has to be validated. I think not until that point, once that whole process is complete, and this can take quite some time, is a project registered with Verra, and then credits are issued. And every so often, at certain key intervals, there is a verification to re-verify that the project continues to do what it says it does. So we have those. I think it's good to kind of talk through that process a little bit. But as has already been mentioned, there are key risks as part of that process. Some we are aware of, some are developing, some we are recognizing as we go along. And I wanted to, because this is a corruption and a compliance conference, I wanted to kind of distinguish a little bit between what is integrity from a compliance and corruption perspective and what is integrity from a social and environmental perspective. To be clear, they go hand in hand and they play into each other. They are related, but perhaps the starting points can sometimes be different. So you have social and environmental integrity, which is what we have in terms of our standard and our rules and our methodologies. And then you have compliance and or integrity from a corruption perspective, which is compliance and implementation, and importantly, enforcement of effective compliance policies covering anti-money laundering, corruption, sanctions, conflict of interest. And to be clear, we need to continuously evolve. I think a speaker at one of the earlier panels said that corruption and perhaps corrupt leaders are very practical. Corruption is very practical. It takes its opportunities wherever it can get them. And we, therefore, need to continuously evolve. We can't stand still. And we need to keep up with that. Now, in terms of some of the integrity risks that we see from Verra's perspective, some have already been mentioned. But from just a carbon credit perspective, of course, we need to ensure that there is consistency in the quality of the credit. We need to ensure that there is a responsible use of credit. You know, that offset isn't just to greenwash, for example, but that certain benefits, as required, by the way, under our standard and our rules, actually go to the community or or provide the wider environmental benefits. Also, that carbon credits are of a high quality, and that we have transparency. And that's the whole point of really having a publicly available register. So once those credits are issued, they go into our registry, and you can look up all projects, and it will tell you who the project proponent is. It will publicly list all the relevant documents, the contractual agreements, the project description report, the monitoring reports, the validation reports, the verification reports. All those will be set out, and it will also tell you the number of credits issued and retired. But I mean, in terms of risk, we operate across a huge variety of jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions are more complicated and complex to operate in. There are certain, and I think it's important to note, this isn't, just in some countries, it's difficult, or in some countries it's corrupt. There can even be regional differences, as we've found. There can be some very great kind of laws and legislation at national, federal level, but then depending on the structural setup of a country, there can be a completely different approach, frankly, on a regional level. And then that is one of the challenges we have faced lately. We've also faced the challenge of regulatory risk, perhaps when there is a change in approach. Many countries are, of course, understandably, under Article 6, getting interested in implementing their own framework, their own carbon markets as part of that, and it's seeking to adjust to that. We, frankly, as Verra, see that as a positive sign, that countries and jurisdictions are getting interested in this and want to do that. But it does mean that you see possibly even more variety in approach, implementation, and enforcement. When it comes to that, you of course have the risk sometimes of governmental change and different attitudes to carbon markets and different stakeholders. Another challenge I would say is in some countries, and many of you will be familiar with this, there's a different categorization of different groups. So we clearly have set out in our standards that there's to be a clear consultation process, FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, with certain groups. Interestingly, in different countries, not all groups are defined in the same way. So groups that would consider themselves to be local communities or indigenous communities aren't always categorized as such in some countries. How do you address that, making sure that everyone is heard, everyone gets a chance to be consulted in relation to a project that affects them? Yes, there is definitely the risk of third-party intermediaries. I would say that there is a distinction between the primary market, which is what Verra operates in. We see what we do as very much an environmental product. The secondary market is when you are starting to talk about financial products. And this is where we now, as maybe some of you will know, are getting regulatory interest, both the CFTC in the US, IOSCO, and we welcome that. We think that a more aligned approach to regulatory approach will benefit the overall market in terms of compliance and consistency and I think quality of credits. We have, in terms of a sectoral approach, we also have the ICVCM, which is a way for carbon standards to ensure integrity. And as part of that, I think there have been actually quite a few initiatives. We have the monitoring periods, for example, for projects has gone up from 30 to 40 years. So just trying to improve as we can. I mean, corruption doesn't stand still, risks don't stand still, so we can't stand still. And we have definitely a policy of constant improvement. There are, of course, key mechanisms that we use to try and meet those challenges. We have VVB performance monitoring now is something that we're implementing. So it's almost kind of a rating of these validation verification bodies where we find that with certain projects, perhaps they have not, problems have arisen that were not clear from the verification report. We are making sure that A, they are trained better, but B, also that there are certain implications, as in perhaps they will not be used anymore, where we find that their verification process has perhaps not ensured a high-quality project or ensured that all the benefits are as they should have been. We have also consolidated some of our methodologies. They're called RED methodologies, so that's reducing emissions from deforestation. Under that, we have what is an improved or perhaps a new baseline system, where previously the project proponent was more involved in setting up and confirming the baseline scenario. So remember I spoke earlier that this is the scenario against which a project, or a counterfactual against which a project is compared. That will no longer be the case in those types of projects. We will be much more robust and involved in setting that up, and that is based on a consultation process, and it's informed by kind of a scientific methodology. And importantly, I think we're using jurisdictional data. So I think, this is perhaps for a separate session, but data is so key in fighting corruption, and that leads to transparency. And we're always trying to work towards improving the data that we have available to evaluate a project. Because as you say, these projects are often on the ground, often in remote areas. And so that kind of transparency that data can give you is so key. What we're also trying to do with that new methodology, the consolidated RED methodology, is to make sure that it aligns with national accounting approaches, which is an approach under the Paris Agreement. this is also seeking to reduce kind of conflict of interest potential and just trying to consistently and constantly add more, I suppose, greater quality control to projects, and in kind of to continuously mitigate the risk that we see. And this is this constant improvement program. Our standards, so these are the rules that we have that projects need to comply with. They are constantly being updated. So recently this year we issued our VCS program, which is our main carbon standard 4.7. That was specifically to align with the new ICVCM requirements, and it was already there, but to really reiterate and emphasize the prohibition on double counting, for example, and to strengthen the safeguards that we need to have in place. So this goes to the social requirements for projects, whether that's free, prior, and informed consent, land ownership. Again, just to add as one of the challenges that we're facing, land ownership and the demonstration of ownership, that can be a real challenge in different jurisdictions, and how that is portrayed again in national databases versus what is happening on the ground. And I think there are challenges within countries as well, that national databases or systems don't always reflect what's happening on ground, and what can you rely on in that case. But I mean, the ICVCM process has been very much pushing and urging kind of consistency, high integrity, but especially kind of a science-based approach and criteria. I know that has been some of our criticism in the past. Yeah, and that we construct perhaps more conservative baselines, so that we that the data informing a baseline is much more conservative about what would have happened had the project not been implemented. I mean, I can go on about quite a few other things, but I know I've been speaking for a while, so I like to give others opportunity.
Thank you for the fascinating overview and highlighting, I think, a few very important points to us. First of all, that integrity is not only the corruption integrity that we always think of, but there are many other elements of integrity. And I wouldn't be a moderator if I wouldn't abuse my position a little bit, because you mentioned two really important, really interesting points on data and land ownership, which are in fact also special working groups under the Practitioners Forum that Brice and I, as well as several of our friends, co-founded, where we, in a systematic way, seek to utilize the power of data, of course, to address corruption risks and deep dive into corruption and land issues. So, I was saying at the beginning that we're going to see certain elements that we can relate to. Certainly, for me, that's happening. So, thank you for giving such a detailed overview and also highlighting the complexity of the issue that you're dealing with. So, shifting over to our third speaker, Phyllis De Nino. Phyllis is the Chief of Party of the USAID-funded Countering Transnational Corruption Grand Challenge, which might immediately make you wonder why Phyllis is speaking here, because when we think of transnational corruption, we don't necessarily think of carbon markets, probably. But this is, in fact, my first question to Phyllis, is considering the many challenges that we relate to transnational corruption, why did your program decide to prioritize this particular issue?
Great. Well, thanks for that question, Johanni. It's a good one. So maybe if I can just provide a little bit of information about what the Grand Challenge is all about, that might be a good way to go about answering it. The Grand Challenge is a little different in typical development modalities, in that it really aims to incentivize partnership and innovation to go after really difficult, vexing development issues. And corruption, and transnational corruption in particular, is certainly that. So this is the 12th Grand Challenge that USAID has launched, and it's a 5-year project, and we have a lot of latitude to develop activities in different areas, and we're more than a year and a half into our 5-year project, and we've already launched a couple of these. We started with one focusing on green mineral supply chains. We've also done one on data for integrity. And we're just on the cusp of announcing winners for doing business with integrity activity. So considering what we wanted to do next, we very much were in alignment with USAID priorities, and climate action is certainly that. And climate finance is a means to provide funding for this critical topic was foremost on our agenda. So we had a couple co-design sessions with key stakeholders who were trying to help us figure out how to scope this activity. And carbon markets emerged as the topic that was seen as particularly important. So for climate finance in general, it's newer, and obviously we've heard from different sessions so far yesterday and today. I've certainly heard from other panelists. What are some of the identified risks? Brice was talking about that too, in terms of the immediacy, the criticality of mobilizing trillions of dollars. So when you have that many resources flowing into a situation, there's a lot of incentives for people to want to get their hands into that pot of money. So certainly that's a big corruption risk. The compressed timelines and sense of urgency is also another big corruption risk. And then if it's new, you don't have these established systems of monitoring and standards, reporting, all that sort of thing. So that's clearly a factor as well. So all those things are true for climate finance, but in particular for carbon markets, that's the case. And so that led us to focus on carbon markets. But as we began our exercise of talking with people like Brice, who's such an expert in this area, and doing our other research, what we found was a lot of talk about integrity issues. And of course, like the Kariba project that in Zimbabwe that Brice talked about was a really good example, a little clear example of those integrity issues. And people were talking about the sort of collapse of the carbon markets, the voluntary carbon markets, starting maybe in mid-2022. And so many initiatives from, let's say, U.S. State Department has an energy transition accelerator, and the LEAF Coalition. There's been, like you mentioned, the yes, the
Integrity Council.
Yes, exactly. All those initials, right? And their core carbon principles. There's been a fair amount of work just in the last year, 2 years, to try to address those integrity issues, which is incredibly important. But we were seeing that some of those they were sort of crowding out for us the corruption issues. And so, sometimes, it's kind of hard to see through it. And what do we, why are integrity issues different from corruption issues? Well, there are a lot of, as both panelists were talking about, these integrity issues, involving things like greenwashing or the inconsistent baselines or double counting, that kind of stuff, could well be corporate fraud, for instance, but it wouldn't necessarily be the kinds of transnational corruption that we're particularly focused on. So that the kind of corruption that entails political and economic elites working together to move resources, in illicit ways, cross boundaries. So when we were doing our scoping, we certainly took advantage of the atlas that TI put together on some of those issues, combing through those cases and others. And we did find that there were plenty of examples of high-level corruption, what we would call good old-fashioned vanilla corruption, and not so much just like those integrity issues. And those are the ones that we felt were really compelling and worth focusing on, alongside all those other initiatives. So, just So we came up with 4, and it doesn't mean that's an exhaustive list by any means, but embezzlement was one. So there's a case of in the DRC of the Minister of Forestries embezzling money that was meant for REDD+, to the tune of, I think, $38 million was that case. Rent seeking would be another category, and that's the award of contract or project approvals to insiders or to those offering kickbacks. There was a good example of in the Slovak government's sale of about 15 million tons of carbon offset units to a firm called Interblue without using a tender or auction. And journalists found that Interblue was actually a shell company set up shortly before the deal, and an Interblue manager that had worked at the ministry earlier bought the units at half their market price and sold them shortly thereafter, making $47 million. So that was a good example there. Land grabbing is another one, and that can involve the appropriation of land from local communities for these carbon offset deals. We have an example from the Republic of Congo where Total Energies, that's a French oil giant, and its local partner leased 70,000 hectares from the government to offset emissions. And that was going to generate $4 million of offsets a year. But then local farmers claim rights to the land, and were arguing that they were not appropriately consulted or compensated by the government, which had requisitioned the land shortly before the deal. So those are some of those cases of high-level corruption that we're particularly focusing on.
Great. Thank you so much in highlighting yet more angles to this issue. So I'm going to try and do the impossible and shift from shift us in this conversation from a lot of the challenges and the risks that we've identified to what can be done about it. And fully realizing that this is an open-ended list, that everybody is exploring this and trying to do their best to figure out how to address it. And I'm keen to also involve the audience in this, so please be prepared after our speakers. I'm keen for you, if you have suggestions on what tools, what approaches might work to also contribute these to the conversation. So let's start in the same sequence. Brice, you want to give it a go?
I can try.
You did give us a very long list of issues, so you had to anticipate that.
So same number. Let's try with the 5, magic 5 today. I will be shorter than my first points, but I mean I think that's it kind of echoes what we discussed until now, no? And I think Mary, you were also mentioning a few things that are going in the direction of the solutions or how to address those issues. I mean, the first one, you were saying data, and so I would say transparency. There is still a lot that is quite opaque around the deals, about the project design documents. I mean, there is some information available, but it's still very difficult. The deals themselves, there is very little information. Again, just coming back to the example I was giving, like it was just very difficult or impossible to get specific information. Then is enabling different actors to see if there is corruption or not. So I think there is the need to kind of establish but also implement those transparency standards. Second one, you mentioned also FPIC and I would say participation, including what is very important for carbon markets are the so-called benefit sharing schemes. So basically, how do we divide the profits? I think that's the key issue. And I think here it's also, there is not a clear answer. No, I think it's also a conversation on what is actually acceptable. But then it also needs to be respected, again, as the example that I was starting with, the Kariba project, where what was promised was not what was delivered. No? And I think this kind of adopting this kind of human rights-centered approach is key if we want to see any trust in those markets. Number three, you also mentioned the land aspects. I mean, at the moment, 20% of land grabbing is so-called green grabbing. There, it's a bit outside of some of what is in the remit of some of the actors of carbon markets. It's something much larger. I mean, people involved in the land topics know that, but I think it's also key, and as you kind of touched a bit as well, it's not only about land rights, but it's also about sometimes what we call carbon rights, which is also still something that is not very defined. So you can have a landowner, but to whom, like if there's a tree on my land, what kind of ownership system is there? If someone else is kind of claiming the carbon linked to that. So it's quite complex, but there need to be some more agreements and regulations there. Number four, we also discussed it. I mean, more robust conflict of interest frameworks, especially for third-party verification, and for regulators maintaining the integrity of the verifiers. I think that's key. There need to be some kind of more robust accreditation processes, some checks by authorities that are also reluctant to do that. And again, it's also, of course, some cost, especially when we talk about these remote aspects. Last one, number 5. I'm already number 5. I was quicker. Accessible compliance mechanisms. That's not only for voluntary carbon markets. There was the big learning from the CDM, from the Clean Development Mechanism until the Kyoto Protocol, where there was no compliance mechanism whatsoever, and that led to basically most of the CDM projects failing, at least according to many studies. And then you also mentioned Article 6 for those in the rooms who wonder what is Article 6 is linked to the Paris Agreement. So Article 6 is basically about carbon markets, let's say, or about this trading between countries. I mean, there are different sets of that, and there has been now it is being created at the moment a compliance mechanism under Article 6.4. We actually were involved in kind of pushing for some improvements of this compliance mechanism, because initially what was suggested is that this compliance mechanism, if you want to put a complaint forward, you would have to pay 5,000 euros. So this is a bit of a problem when we think that people who might have to complain, first they will need to know the existence of this compliance mechanism, how to access it. But if we are talking about communities in remote locations, 5,000 euros or dollars is quite a high number. So it's quite unrealistic to ask for this kind of settings. And linked to the compliance mechanisms, that was also in the Kariba project that I mentioned. Whistleblower protection is also key. We saw it in that case. I mean, there was a whistleblower case, and actually, I think it was end of last year, maybe, in the US, the derivatives market regulator actually did a public call for whistleblowers on carbon markets, so calling for whistleblowers to contact the authorities if they have some case, and I think that's also quite key, or that can help at least.
Thank you so much, Brice, especially for matching your risks with your solutions. That's great. Let's see how many we can collect today. And actually, I feel a little bit unfair towards Mary, because her first intervention already included a whole lot of ways in which you're practically seeking to address these risks. But I just want to give you the chance again, if you want to add anything in terms of specific tools to address corruption risks.
I have
in
more.
This space. Amazing. I'm keeping track.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would add this event. Events like this and feedback from key stakeholders and organizations that are intricately involved in this space is key, because that's the only way that we can keep up with developments and what happens in the corruption space and different ways that might manifest itself. So these events, feedback from discussion partners, feedback from the audience, all of that is actually a part of the solution, I would say. We have more perhaps technical sector-specific tools as well. We have what's called a non-permanence risk tool that we use to basically rate the risk of projects, including forestry projects. That was last year also updated to basically increase the risk scores whenever there is uncertainty, for example, about consultation or land ownership. So just kind of that there will be basically a higher hurdle to jump for a project to get registered if there are any issues, or if there has been, I think, within the past, within a certain time frame, any kind of jurisdictional change in approach to ownership, whether that's of carbon rights. And yes, you're exactly right, there's that distinction between carbon rights ownership and land ownership. Sometimes there are licenses where the landowner will give a license to another entity to develop the project. The landowner may not have the capacity, expertise to do that, but they have an arrangement in place. And again, of course, that leads to possibly sometimes then an invitation for a form of corruption. And then that is definitely something that needs to be watched. There are many different actors involved in this space. You talked about complaints. So we have a grievance redress policy. We've had it in place for some time. But again, we cannot be complacent. So we update that. We updated it last year and again this year in April to strengthen the mechanisms by which people can bring complaints, who they can be. Essentially can be almost anyone. We focus on specific stakeholders like project proponents, local communities, those affected by projects. But if you can bring a complaint, there is a kind of a catch-all category as well. And importantly, and this goes to the whistleblowing point, you can also bring a complaint anonymously. And we will respect that anonymity and try. We obviously need, I would say, a minimum amount of information to be actually able to do something about a complaint. So sometimes there will be a bit of asking for more information so that we can actually address the issue. Sometimes it's not clear which project, for example, is being talked about. You know, that's a key piece of information. We also, I think it's important to follow best practice. You know, we're a 501c registered nonprofit organization, but we follow best practice as it relates more closely to, say, profit-based or even regulated entities in terms of our compliance policies, and also this grievance redress policy. I think it's important to mention here that actually part of the solution, or part of the portfolio of solutions maybe, is this regulatory interest, because I think that's making everyone kind of sit up a bit more and pay attention, including in the secondary, more financial markets. I think all I would say about that is that we welcome that interest. We would only recommend that it is aligned with existing initiatives, so the ICVCM and others, so that we are not duplicating efforts and maybe creating any gaps or loopholes, right? If we're all acting in an aligned way, that hopefully will seek further strengthen kind of transparency and robustness here. And as a parallel exercise, you know, the expansion of due diligence and KYC checks, you know, traditionally we've been very focused on the project proponent, but as we see here, you know, there are so many different entities that can be involved in a project, and finding ways of how can we also check perhaps other more indirect parties that are associated with a project somehow, and get a better risk profile for a project. I mean, that's really important. One of my favorites, so I know there are all these big sector-specific initiatives, there's regulators, but actually some of my favorite approaches, if I may say that, are the approaches that seek to engage with local communities more. So we have a nature framework and safeguards initiative in which we're actually consulting specifically with local communities directly. So this isn't happening as between the project and the validation body and the project proponent, but directly as Verra with communities, so that they can actually input and feedback on the nature framework and how we might improve safeguards, whether that's, you know, gender-specific consultations in certain jurisdictions, you know, making sure that there's an awareness of that. Of course, local languages, the way in which people conceptualize land. Frankly, that can be very different across jurisdictions, and the meaning that land has to people, that is reflected. I'm sure there's more, but again, I will make sure others have an opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm counting 9, if I'm keeping track accurately. Not that the total number matters, but still, double digits would be nice. So, Phyllis, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I guess I have the benefit of going third, and I could just say yes to all of the above. I think the way we look at it is, yes, all of those are potential solutions. Definitely, the work on transparency, standardizing decision-making, strengthening accountability in things like procurement or regulation, certification, licensing, oversight entities, all of those things would be relevant. In addition, you mentioned transparency, certainly data transparency, risk assessment tools, integrity packs and initiatives, land use tracking to strengthen, these are tools that could strengthen local governance or corporate standards and due diligence, or monitoring by communities or environmental journalists and so civil society groups. All those things could certainly be important, but a lot of those will depend on the local context in terms of what is needed, what are the opportunities, what are the constraints, and so that's why we are aiming to crowdsource these solutions as opposed to picking and choosing among them. So we are very excited to be able to announce that we are launching a $3 million Safeguarding Carbon Markets Challenge in partnership with BHP Foundation and the World Bank. And we are aiming to accept different concept notes until mid-August, and we're hoping to make awards of up to $500,000 each in probably February of 2025 by the time it's all done. And just as a note, for those who are interested, we are going to be hosting an open house tomorrow at 4:15 p.m. in room 5.3 to provide more information on that to anyone who's interested in applying, or just other stakeholders. So that's, and that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you so much for the announcement. That's, I think, really exciting. I noticed everybody started taking notes much more diligently the moment you announced it. Yeah. I'm sure you all wish you kept track of all these other ideas before. No, I'm joking, of course. And there is a recording, as far as I understand. Let's go to the audience. We have about 20 minutes left. During which to discuss. I see, oh, that's great. I see the hands come up. So, but with your questions, please be prepared to also suggest one solution. So we're sort of practice oriented. So I will, to be honest, I didn't see the sequence of hands coming up, so I'm just going to do a sweep if you don't mind. Maybe take 3 questions starting here from the right. Sir, yes, please.
Thanks all. I am Amin Sadrnejad from Tehran Chamber of Commerce, Iran. I asked this question yesterday and didn't get the answer, and I need to ask it again. How could you simultaneously have a good, strong, and independent due diligence process and still have corruption at this level to discuss it in this panel, in environmental funds or things like this, carbon markets? And let me tell you a personal experience. Let's move back in the time in 8 years ago. There was a couple of years before Trump sanctions against Iran. My company was involved in a project with UNIDO, and still we have Italian partners in that time. And we didn't experience a strong, independent, or breathtaking due diligence process. That was so easy. I experienced much more due diligence, harder due diligence processes in Iran in our domestic contracts. And I think that was something that we can think about it. A strong due diligence process could prevent, could minimize the risk of corruption at this level? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Sir, here in the front, there was a question as well. We're doing a right to left from my side.
I have a question and then I'll propose a solution as well. My name is Rukshana. I work for the International Land Coalition. So in our work, the center is land rights and land tenure rights. So my first question is actually to Mary to ask to what extent that you take into consideration customary land rights of people, right? So our approach to this work is that whether we like it or not, carbon markets are here to stay, right? So we need to deal with that, but also with our members, more than 300 members across the world. It clearly shows that tree planting is not working. So you should go to the field, talk to the people, and tree planting has not been working, which is foreign to them. And there are a lot of dynamics involved with that. So I'm not going to get into details. So the solution is that we all know, I'm sorry, but something that elephant in the room is like capitalism is like ripping us apart. So, so then how do you change the approach from the profit-making approach to like people-centric approach, right? So very glad to hear your last point in terms of having people in the center of our work. So how do you make sure that you approach the carbon markets from a viewpoint of ecosystem restoration and having people at the center of that, right? So, and very happy to see the constructive discussion because it's a very heated field right now.
Thank you very much, and also thank you for your suggestion and coming up with another heat comparison. So I'm collecting these today. Over here, ma'am, please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Britta Delmers, working with Public Eye Switzerland. We focus a lot on traders and commodities trade, and the commodities traders are now also getting into this carbon credit business. They are creating carbon credits. They want to deal with them. Do you see them as a specific risk? Is that something that is on the radar? What do we do to prevent things like the artificial markets that exist for some of the commodities already, like grain also, where the market sometimes doesn't have anything to do with the real value of things that are traded there, just because so many traders are involved and want to make a profit. Solution, we would suggest more supervision, actually the introduction of specified commodities trader and commodities supervisory authorities, similar to the financial market authorities, who then also have the specialization to understand things like the carbon credits. Yes. Or a limitation of the number of traders, which is also always a very good thing to keep the prices from this irrational movement.
Thank you so much. I doubt you'll get very many opponents in this room about regulating commodity traders more, but thank you for bringing this up, and thank you for the fantastic work that Public Eye is doing. If those of you haven't been reading it, it's not an easy task to look at commodity traders in Switzerland. Yeah, ma'am, you had a question. 2 questions in the front row. Okay, and then we'll cut it. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can, and then we'll come back to the second half of the room. Please.
Thank you. My name is Paulette. I'm from Chile. And I'm an investigative journalist, but I'm looking for the first time into the carbon market. And I'm actually very interested in this principle of additionality that you mentioned, like, vaguely. So I would like to know, we've talked about people, and I think it's really important, but particularly in my country, what I'm seeing and I'm worried about is that the real estate is starting to sell land in the south away from communities. There's no people that are being affected by the intervention on property on these lands, but they are selling them with this kind of attached to the commitment to sell those carbon credits. So I am wondering, these forests are not currently threatened by anything, okay? This is native forests in Patagonia, like nothing is, there are no even roads, there's no civilization around. Many of them are protected by the native forestry law. and still they are selling these carbon credits. And what I hear from the company that is selling this land is that, well, they have the baseline, so everything that they can measure from now on is somehow like additional so that they can sell that carbon credit. And I'm like, yeah, but there's no reduction that's actually happening here. And you're not really preventing, because this land is not being threatened. And they're actually selling these carbons. So I just want to know, I don't know, like what happens in that case, and how do we tackle that?
And yes, the final question for this round.
Yes, thank you. My name is Anna Koens. I work for Journalism Fund Europe, and we provide funding for investigative journalists. So I actually kind of happen to elaborate on what Paulette just said, because I'm actually really glad to see a Verra representative on this panel so that we're able to ask direct questions. And I'm very interested in what you mentioned about updating your methodologies, because you didn't refer to any specific period, because I don't know how many people here are aware that last year the CEO had to step down after the academic reports into that various numbers were effectively blown up, in some cases up to 400%. And there were at least 3, if I'm not mistaken, reports, one in the University of Cambridge, another internationally based, and then University of Oxford researchers reviewed that independently, and the Guardian reporters reviewed that independently, and they all found incredible discrepancy between what Verra estimated were carbon credits that could be sold and what were effective carbon credits that were attached to those projects. And that in some cases, in one of the reports, 3/4 of all the carbon credits came from only 3 projects out of several dozens. So I know Verra responded to this criticism. So I was wondering how much you updated methodology since then, what specifically you updated, how much you are trying to prevent these cases when you count carbon credits for forests which are not threatened by anything at all, and whether these forecasts about avoiding deforestation, which is generally criticized by scientists, how is that being taken into consideration? And Johanni, as for solutions, I think there are at least 2 things which I hear from many people working on carbon credits that could be done. One is sending more people on the ground, because of course you mentioned remote areas, but a company like Verra or any other voluntary carbon credit company is honestly earning a lot of money, so they, unlike natural forestry rangers, should be able to reach those remote areas and actually control what happens on the ground without somebody complaining about it first. So one would be actually checking on the ground more often without being prompted to do that. Well, I don't know if that's, for example, something that regulators will be asking. That's also another point that would be interested to learn about in detail. And the second solution would be maybe to collaborate a little bit more with academic researchers without dismissing their approach as being not viable in our commercial world, which was one of Verra's comments. And you can just Google up Verra and the Guardian investigation from 2023. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you. For 2 solutions. I'm sure there won't be enough time for a comprehensive response to all the comments and questions, but we're going to do our best. And we have this very intimidating clock that is facing us, that's ticking down. I would suggest we do this. So I can't take any more questions, clearly, which I apologize to the left half of the room. I suggest we give the panelists the chance to respond to the questions, and then I'm sure they don't mind sticking around for another 10 minutes for further discussions after the event ends, because otherwise I'll be in trouble with the organizers if we go over our end of day schedule. So should we go in the, I don't know what sequence should we go in? Let's stick to a tried and proven sequence. Brice, you want to go first? And by the way, for anybody who's counting, I'm up to 18. There might be a few repetitions, but that's pretty good. Please, Brice.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, we don't have that much time, and I don't have that much to add, but I think maybe, I mean, I'm not sure I got the first question around the due diligence. Did you mean that did you just suggest to do like a stronger due diligence, or did you ask about the tension between doing more due diligence and then delaying some processes, or? Sorry? Stronger policies. Okay, okay. Yeah, no, so I mean, I agree. Basically, I think, yeah, all the recommendations or all the ideas are agreed. I mean, I think on the, I think, yeah, I mean, basically for me, that comes down to, yeah, more regulation. I mean, there were a couple of questions, or I think it came with the suggestions to basically have more regulation, have the regulators being able to do some checks. This is also what I was saying before, to do some spot checks. Then there is indeed the question of who is paying for that, and there is the question also of who is paying for the certification or the verification. That is already what I mentioned before in terms of this conflict of interest, which there could be also other frameworks that we could see, that might kind of avoid that risk or that conflict of interest. So I completely agree, and I think for me that's the kind of key aspects that is missing is regulation, but also enforcement, because even when we talked about FPIC or land aspects and so on, there are some requirements even from the RED Plus programs that were actually designed from the UN system that actually requires consultation, requires compliance mechanisms, but what we see is that those are just not being implemented, and even when it's by the different actors, whereas it's at the state level or project implementer level and so on. And I think that one thing that, and I think what you said, Rukhsana, about carbon markets is there. So let's see how we can improve them. Is that someone from another verifier actually say basically that this is not perfect, and that person even say we wouldn't exist if there would be political will. So I think we also have to keep in mind that those markets can be also used, so to speak, because the governments are actually not investing where they should be investing in. So I think also putting it back to the role of governments, of regulating that is also important. And the last aspect, I mean, you said that, Mary, as well, around the having these kind of conversations, and I would say collaboration is also important. I mean, one interesting thing that we saw, even if it didn't, maybe it didn't work as well as it could have been, because it was in Kenya, and there's a lot of cases also, including in the Climate Corruption Atlas that you can find on Transparency International website, where we list some cases, and quite a few are carbon market cases. But there was an interesting initiative from Kenya where there was an integrity task force for carbon markets, or at least for RED Plus at that time, that was putting around the table the different actors, including civil society, including the Anti-Corruption Commission. So I think looking at some of those models would also be quite valuable.
Thank you very much, Brice. Mary, over to you.
Sure. I can take them in turn, or maybe actually I think we should, if I may take the last question first, because I think that was the most in-depth and probably also very key and important question. I mean, first of all, to your specific example about Chile, I can't speak to any specific projects at the moment. I don't know. But I would say that any question of additionality, which is a key component of a validation and verification, should be tested at that point. And it is clearly that the project A would not have happened but for this funding through the carbon offsets project. But also that they have to show that there is an actual risk. So, I mean, without any knowledge of the specific project or circumstances, I would say, a project that cannot demonstrate that shouldn't normally go through successfully through the validation and verification project if it is indeed not under threat. But again, I don't know the specifics of that project. then again, obviously, the Guardian article and the journalism last year and the articles, that was, I think, a key stage for Verra. I would say, and I know it is often presented this way, and also by the Guardian, David Antonioli did step down at the time, but it was not as a result of that. I know it is presented like that, but if you work at Verra, you know that was not actually the catalyst for that. We are updating methodologies, a range of methodologies. I think I already gave the example of our VM0048, which is our consolidated RED. And that we've worked on that for quite a long time, again, even before the Guardian article came out. But updating methodologies is a long-term process. We consult on that. We make sure that we speak to academics. We actually do that part as part of our normal process to make sure that we are informed that the scientific assumptions, I suppose, that we are making are correct. And again, I think I mentioned earlier as part of when I was talking about the challenges, there are updates to science. There are updates to how much data you can get for a particular region that gives you a better insight into what the deforestation rate is, what is the reference period, things like that. I mean, you get into quite technical things that I would probably should allow my colleagues to speak to a bit more eloquently than I can. But those are all kind of key components of updating our methodologies. And I think a really key part of the updated methodology is this change from no longer having the project proponent be responsible for proposing the methodology and the baseline. To take that out, because and to separate that process out and to have more oversight over that. We have, of course, responded in depth to the Guardian in many different ways, including on various websites and other means to kind of question, I would suppose, the methodologies that were used. We engaged with the Guardian. I'm not sure that all our comments were taken on board, and that's fine. That's, they are an independent investigative newspaper. I think that the whole process at the time when that article was published, the underlying journal article that was based on had not been peer reviewed. We also had a disagreement about the basis for the assumption in terms of the reference area. So yeah, I mean, these are really complex technical things that there can be disagreements on, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a need for constant improvement. We did also specifically reject the volumes and the statement about the value of credits and how many are of high quality. Again, we rejected that. The basis for that, again, was questioned also in other journal articles, this figure of, I think it was 80 or 90% that has been questioned, I should say. So we've refuted those numbers that were given in the Thales article. But again, since then also a lot has happened. We have engaged with the market. There's the ICVCM process. We are making our standards more robust. And I think that, again, this is part of the solution. I would say that the Guardian article, as much as we perhaps disagree with some of the methodology and approach, is also part of the solution. This is all part of informing us of what we need to be looking at, what we need to focus on. Just bearing in mind that carbon projects, there is an important component here of directing funds to very important projects that support and underpin either the avoidance of deforestation, sustainable development, and biodiversity. That is not to say that the means by which that is being done cannot consistently and continuously be improved, I would say. But we can also speak more after, gladly. So some of the other questions, just on the question of stronger due diligence, I think I did mention that as one of the things that we see as part of the solution that we are doing, making that due diligence, more robust, but also widening the net of our due diligence. I think there has been a kind of very much a focus on the project developer and project proponent, and maybe that net in terms of other actors that needs to be widened, and the questions. Again, I mean, this is a point about transparency. It's very hard to get at in some jurisdictions, especially who all the actors are. You know, you have jurisdictions where entities are set up on purposely to avoid that transparency, you know, and that is also a challenge that we need to definitely address. On the customary land rights question, I think that I'm glad you asked that question, because that actually goes back to what is one of my favorite solutions, is that our nature framework and the safeguards, and talking to local communities and indigenous groups directly so that they can inform our draft documents and our thinking about what is really needed in terms of safeguards. What do you need? Not just assumptions that we make maybe, but what is it that people need on the ground, which can be different perhaps from what some of the agreed or accepted standards are at the moment, and it's making sure that we reflect that. Public eyes. Yeah, there is of course a focus on traders and carbon credits. This is what we call the secondary carbon market. CFTC, IOSCO are very interested in this, derivatives markets. I think there is a lot of scope for regulatory oversight there. I think it is interesting that financial regulators have taken the initiative here. We don't really see environmental regulators coming into this space as loudly at the moment. For consistency and maybe a more holistic approach, I mean, what we do as Verra is separate from the secondary market and those financial products. So what we see a credit or a unit in our registry is actually an environmental product, if you will. And so we would, you know, I think it would be interesting if we saw a little bit more interest from environmental regulators, or maybe more of an alignment between the thinking between those. But yeah, there's a lot of things happening in that space as well. I hope I covered everyone.
Thank you so much for the comprehensive response to a number of questions. Phyllis, the clock is ticking down, as you can see, and it is now turned red. So this is even more intimidating. Did you want to add anything else?
No, thanks, Johanni. I'm all set.
Okay, go to the Grand Challenge website to see the announcement about the procurement notice.
And tomorrow, right?
And tomorrow to the open house. Yes.
And tomorrow's open house. That's right. So you don't even have to do it on the website. You can do it in person. All right. Thank you, everybody. I see that our audience is also thinning out a little bit. Probably people got hungry. I really appreciate the active participation. Thank you so much. I apologize to this part of the room about not getting to your questions. Sorry. But hopefully you get the chance to speak to the speakers still before dinner. So thanks again, and see you at the other sessions. We have quite a few related topics. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks.